Turning Tides is an Antiks entertainment production. You can find the show on social media at the Turning Tides Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, and YouTube, and at Turning Tides Pod on Bluesky and Mastodon. For more information, or if you're interested in sponsoring the podcast or collaborating, please contact us at the Turning Tides Podcast at gmail.com. Thank you. Warning. This episode of Turning Tides contains depictions of murder, sexual assault, war, violence, torture, child abuse, suicide, and genocide.
In the greatness of your majesty, you threw down those who opposed you. You unleashed your burning anger. It consumed them like stubble. The Book of Exodus, chapter 7, verse 7. As the saying goes, Rome was not built in a day. From the early Roman kings to the Republic, to the Gracchi brothers and the civil wars, Rome weathered many storms. In 33 B.C.E., a new civil war broke out. Two former brothers-in-law began this war, which would decide the fate of numerous polities in and around the Mediterranean basin. Two Roman factions were at odds with one another over the direction in which the Republic was headed. A Palestinian man, remembered as Herod the Great, was one of the most important figures in this war. Herod was born in 72 B.C.E. to Judean and Idumean parents, while the Roman Republic began to crumble. His family's rise to power was both unlikely and indicative of massive change in the Mediterranean. The perpetual state of chaos in this area allowed him to gain immense power and wealth. He would become one of the wealthiest people in the Roman world, and as a result, Herod would come to dominate southwestern Asia. Roman society during this period was being ripped apart by two political factions, remembered as the Optimates and the Populares, or the Republicans and the Democrats. The Optimates wanted to maintain the unwritten Roman constitution, as well as the social and class-based order of Roman society. The Populares wanted to expand Roman citizenship, increase land allotments to the poorest, and in general make Roman society more equitable. These issues had only been getting worse since the end of the Second Punic War. During that conflict, Rome expanded its borders in all directions, while also denying basic rights to the people who were now forced into Roman servitude. The violence with which the Roman army treated the people who were enslaved and trafficked, as well as rebellious client states and Roman quote-unquote allies, ensured frequent revolts. The Populares believed Rome could not continue to function as is, unless serious reforms were enacted, and regulations were placed on the nobility and the ultra-rich. The Optimates felt that the real problem was a, quote, lack of manliness, unquote, on the part of these new Romans. In a nauseating display of privilege, they argued that in the good old days of the Republic, the poor did not demand things. They asked how they could assist their betters. The tribune of the plebs was one of the few ways a Roman citizen could gain any semblance of political representation. This position was chosen by the people of the city, who were called the plebeians, or proletarii. Several tribunes gained immense political power through the use of their office. Some, like the Gracchi brothers, who both served during the 2nd century B.C.E., were assassinated by conservative senators who hated the tribunate. Other tribunes who dared to rock the boat were forced to commit ritualistic suicide. In spite of the Senate's hatred of these figures, the tribunes were immensely popular with the poorest Romans. The Gracchi brothers became heroes and the places in which they were executed became quasi-religious pilgrimage sites for the poor, in spite of Roman laws prohibiting the mention of these brothers. The Republic would decay further with the rise of Marius, who led the populares through an incredibly turbulent period. He was named consul, or co-leader of the Republic, on several consecutive occasions. During his consulships, he was victorious throughout numerous military campaigns, and he instituted many changes within the Roman military. These reforms are remembered as the Marian reforms. They created, amongst other things, a standing Roman army. As their professional army became increasingly loyal to their commanders as opposed to the Republic, more and more problems arose. Marius found himself opposing Cornelius Sulla. Sulla aligned himself with the Optimates and began what is remembered as the First Roman Civil War against Marius and his supporters. Following his victory, Sulla would institute a reign of terror in which thousands of well-known populares were murdered on the orders of the conservative dictator. Throughout the rest of the Roman territory, the colonies were sucked dry of their resources through taxation, brutality, and exploitation. Roman governors gained their position by promising to outdo one another in gathering more exorbitant taxes from the people they governed. Chief of the Caledonians, Calgacus, explained the daily depravity in which the Romans engaged, saying, quote, "You find in the Romans an arrogance which no reasonable submission can elude. Brigands of the world, they have exhausted the land by their indiscriminate plunder, and now they ransack the sea. The wealth of an enemy excites their greed, his poverty their lust of power. Robbery, butchery, rape, the liars call empire. They create a desolation, and call it peace. Our loved ones are now being torn from us by conscription to slave in other lands. Our wives and sisters, even if they are not raped by enemy soldiers, are harassed by men who are supposed to be our friends and guests. Our goods and money are consumed by taxation. Our land is stripped of its harvests to fill their granaries. Our hands and limbs are crippled by building roads through forests and swamps under the lash of our oppressors. We Britons are sold into slavery anew every day. We have to pay the purchase price ourselves and feed our masters in addition." Unquote. This was the case in Britain, but also in Palestine. Here, the Romans allowed the Maccabees to remain the rulers, in name only, of the inland area, but their rule was incredibly unstable. Many Palestinians rebelled throughout the period between 60 and 30 B.C.E. Along the coast, the Romans annexed several important cities directly into the Republic, while also granting autonomous status to others. In this latter category was the city of Caesarea Palestinae. Herod the Great named the city after the new Augustus Caesar, or Emperor Octavian. Today, the city is usually called Caesarea on the coast, or Caesarea Maritima. Although we can't be sure of the reason for this name change, it's likely that supporters of Zionism have attempted to erase and change the names of many cities which reference the name Palestine, as is apparent in modern-day maps of the area. Well into the rise of the Byzantine or Eastern Roman Empire, the city of Caesarea Palestinae flourished. It was the most populous and economically powerful of all the cities in Roman Palestine. In time, it would become an administrative capital of Palestine, in addition to being a center of philosophy and education. The city's library, which was built in the 3rd century CE, would come to rival the libraries of Athens and Alexandria. The books that filled this library would inspire 7th century Arabic and Islamic scholars to begin their own golden age. Meanwhile, in Europe, Christendom actively destroyed literature on philosophy, science, medicine, and history. During the 1st century B.C.E., the Roman Republic's troubles never ceased. In fact, many historians point to the formation of the First Triumvirate as the true beginning of the end of the Republic. In this context, a triumvirate is a group of 3 political figures. It was composed of Gnaeus Pompey, Marcus Crassus, and Julius Caesar. Pompey had the prestige, Crassus had the money, and Caesar had the ambition. Their powers combined, they ran roughshod over the barely alive Roman Republic. Some combination of the 3 usually served as Rome's consul, while the others were out stealing land and putting down uprisings of enslaved peoples. Pompey had already conquered Syria and Palestine. Caesar was in the middle of conquering Gaul and Britain, killing perhaps 1 million people in the process, and Crassus had recently put down the uprising of Spartacus, crucifying any of the former gladiators who survived. Crassus was particularly interested in further pillaging and land stealing, so he raised an army and headed east to invade the Parthian Empire. The Parthians, originally from Central Asia, invaded and supplanted the long-gone Seleucids as the ruling power in modern-day Iran. The Parthians and then the Sassanids who replaced them were Rome's main rivals. The 2 powers would fight numerous wars with one another for centuries to come. Crassus, in spite of being one of the richest men in Rome, pilfered the riches of the Second Temple in order to fund his eastern military expedition. At Carrhae, his army of 39,000 was ambushed by Parthian horse archers. The legionnaires assembled into a massive square formation for protection, but in doing so, they had completely trapped themselves. Parthian arrows, as well as intense heat and dehydration, ravaged the troops. Crassus sent his son with a force of 6,000 veterans to try to pin down the Parthians. This Roman contingent was lured away from the main army before being surrounded and completely destroyed. Following this, Crassus attempted to retreat. In the process, he left behind thousands of wounded who were soon massacred by the Parthians. Realizing he was completely out of options, Crassus asked the Parthians to negotiate. The Parthians feigned compliance, then fell on Crassus and his army, killing him and tens of thousands of his men. 5,000 traumatized Romans were all that returned to Syria. The Parthian king, Orad II, ordered the decapitation of Crassus, after which he had servants pour molten gold into Crassus's mouth, before saying, quote, "Be satisfied now with thy life's desire." Unquote. With the death of Crassus, the triumvirate ruptured. At the same time, Pompey aligned himself with the Optimates, while Caesar maintained his lifelong alliance with the Populares. The Optimates were the most powerful within the Roman Senate, and fearing Caesar's growing popularity with the Proletarii, they colluded with Pompey to illegally name him sole consul in 52 B.C.E. As is the case today, conservatives and the ruling classes were fine with engaging in illegal acts as long as they were the only ones allowed to do it. Rome was once more living under the thumb of a conservative dictator. In 50 B.C.E., the Roman Senate demanded Caesar return to Italy in order to formally face charges. Roman law stipulated that no armies were allowed in Italy proper, so when Caesar crossed the small Rubicon River in 49 B.C.E., he officially started the Great Roman Civil War. Realizing that the Proletarii of Rome and Italy were largely on the side of Caesar, Pompey withdrew to the Balkans to regroup and gain supporters from the conservatives in the area. Shortly after being named dictator, Caesar crossed the Straits of Otranto and brought the fight directly to Pompey. At the Battle of Pharsalus, Caesar outwitted and easily defeated his former brother-in-law. Pompey withdrew once more to Egypt, where he was killed by his own supporters, as they assumed Caesar would appreciate the betrayal. Seeing the decapitated head of his old friend and former brother-in-law, Caesar openly wept and had Pompey's assassins executed. Arriving in Egypt, remnants of the Pompeian Optimates cause had aligned themselves with Cleopatra's brother and co-ruler. At the same time, Caesar and Cleopatra began a love affair, in which Cleopatra is alleged to have given birth to a son, sired by Caesar. Caesar was besieged in Alexandria, where he was forced to fight off numerous assaults by local Egyptians who had risen against Cleopatra. Caesar could not hope to outlast the Egyptian soldiers forever. In nearby Palestine, Antipater, a former ally of Pompey, declared his support for Caesar and led an army into Egypt. Once in Egypt, he rallied the Jewish people living in the country to his banner, and they endeavored to save Caesar. Grateful for the assistance, Caesar appointed Antipater as procurator of Judea. His two sons, Faisal and Herod, were given control over Jerusalem and parts of the modern-day West Bank, respectively. Although the Maccabees still symbolically ruled Jerusalem as high priests, their dynasty effectively ended with Caesar's decree. The civil war continued for another 3 years as Pompey's children and supporters continued to fight in his name. Caesar would fight throughout modern-day Turkey and North Africa before returning to Rome for his triumph in 46 B.C.E. In 45, he finished his career of military campaigns by suppressing Pompeian rebellions in Spain. During his triumph, he was celebrated as the quote-unquote imperator and the savior of Rome and its people. Following his triumph, he was subjected to a round of heckling from the veterans of his many campaigns. In song, they accused Caesar of being a spendthrift who spent the money sent to the army on hiring sex workers in Gaul. Additionally, Caesar's relationship with the king of Pontus, along with various other men, was a point of contention for his many conservative enemies. This was, of course, the peak of hypocrisy from a conservative Roman parasite class who frequently raped the peoples they had trafficked and enslaved, regardless of their gender. Pedophilia was also common amongst this group. Enslaved peoples had no rights whatsoever, and they had no recourse when they were assaulted, beaten, raped, or murdered by the traffickers. Caesar was a human trafficker as well, so enslaved peoples felt no difference in his rule as opposed to any other dictator. Regardless, for quote-unquote free Roman citizens, Caesar promised to return the governance of the republic back to the people. He promised to restore the political rights of the tribunes, and he promised to grant citizenship to many of Rome's subjects, while also ending the rule of what he called a, quote, small clique, unquote. He seemed to fulfill many of these promises. In one of his first decrees, he gave 80,000 Roman veterans large tracts of land in the newly established Roman colonies. Many moved to Caesarea Palestinae. This is one of the reasons that many Palestinians can trace portions of their genetic code back to ancient Rome. Caesar also allocated vast amounts of land in Campania to be distributed to the poorest of the proletarii. For the lower and middle classes, he remitted rents for an entire year, while also redistributing stolen loot to the poorest Roman citizens. Next, he raised tariffs, but strictly on luxury goods, making sure that basic needs like food were not affected. For the colonies which were being sucked dry from taxation, he imposed a cap on the maximum amount allowed to be collected, while also putting in place a land tax, which would have required the richest to contribute more to the community. For religious minorities like Jewish people, Caesar decreed the religion legal, and allowed Jewish people to be governed by their own religious laws while they resided in any Roman settlement. The burgeoning Jewish population of Rome appreciated Caesar's gesture deeply. Conservatives like Cicero hated the Jewish presence in the city and complained openly about the increase in the Jewish population, as well as the political power they had under Caesar. Cicero bemoaned pretty much everything about Caesar's dictatorship. He claimed Caesar was vicious and was intent on, quote, an onslaught on private property and cancellation of debt, unquote. Amongst the proletarii, however, Caesar was well loved. Michael Parenti concludes, quote, Caesar accumulated individual power in order to break the oligarchic stranglehold and thereby initiate popular reforms. His reign may be called a dictatorship of the proletarii, an instance of ruling autocratically against plutocracy on behalf of the citizenry's substantive interests, unquote. Caesar's dictatorship was incredibly short-lived. On March 15th, 44 B.C.E., Caesar was stabbed to death by several members of the Senate, who were all involved in a conspiracy to end the dictator's life and reassert their own power over the Senate. The assassins genuinely believed that they had returned liberty to the people. So when the people began to riot and rebel, conservative senators had to haphazardly flee Rome. Cassius left for Syria and Palestine, where he instituted a reign of terror against the local population by brutally taxing the people in order to fund his fledgling quote-unquote Republican rebellion. They needed all the help they could get. Cassius and his co-conspirators were about to face down the Second Triumvirate. This triumvirate consisted of Mark Antony, Marcus Lepidus, and Gaius Octavius. Antony was the lieutenant and best friend of Caesar. Lepidus was Caesar's former cavalry commander. Octavius was Caesar's nephew, but he also proved to be an extremely capable politician before eventually becoming the first emperor of Rome. The Second Triumvirate was more than a match for Caesar's killers. In the 2 battles of Philippi, both Cassius and Brutus would commit suicide. Following their victories, the Second Triumvirate split the Roman territory amongst themselves. Lepidus was rendered politically immobile by Octavius, who turned him into a political prisoner until his death. This left Octavius and Antony as the 2 heads of the Republic. Their agreement was cemented by the marriage of Mark Antony to Octavius's sister. They began a reign of terror against the conservative optimates and refused to show mercy, as Caesar had done. Thousands of conservative senators and their supporters were executed. The story goes that Cicero was fleeing in a wagon, and when he turned to look at his pursuers, he was beheaded. In Palestine, the new Herodian dynasty was experiencing a multitude of issues, attempting to placate the population. Many of the local Jewish Palestinians considered Herod and his family to be illegitimate rulers. This was based on the fact that his family was descended from the Idumeans, who had only recently been forced to mass convert to Judaism. It did not help that Herod, even at an early age, was capable of intense acts of violence and depravity. Attempting to placate the local population, Herod took a Maccabean princess as his wife, but it failed to make a serious impression. Instead, the last of the Maccabeans, Antigonus, leveraged the hatred the people had for Herod into a national revolt. He had the direct support of Parthia, who had used the instability in Rome to expand their empire into most of southwestern Asia. The people of Jerusalem opened the gates of this city for the invading Parthians, and they placed Antigonus on the throne. He was also made high priest of the Second Temple. Herod's brother was killed, while Herod barely escaped with his life. Herod, as well as a small group of his troops, his concubines, and his wife, were now homeless vagabonds. They managed to defeat a detachment of horsemen sent to capture them, and then made it to the court of Cleopatra, who provided Herod with a boat, which was bound for Rome. Once there, he was escorted by Antony and Octavius to the Senate building, where the Roman Senate declared Herod to be, quote, king of the Judeans and a friend of Rome, unquote. Thus began the 40-year reign of Herod the Great. It was one defined by opulence, butchery, incest, and tyranny. Herod was now king of Judea, but in name only. He needed to sail back to Palestine and win back his throne by the sword. Antigonus controlled Jerusalem and the greater part of Palestine due to the aid of his Parthian allies. Once Herod returned, he conquered most of the country in a lightning campaign of destruction, but he did not have enough men to assault and capture Jerusalem. Instead, he moved his forces north to assist Mark Antony, who was in the process of besieging the Parthian fortress of Samosata, which was located in modern-day southwestern Turkey. The Parthian army arrived close behind Herod. During the ensuing battle, Roman forces operating under Mark Antony were utterly crushed by Parthia, but Herod's men managed to save the Roman supply train from capture. This act of heroism ingratiated Herod with Antony. As a way of saying thank you, Antony dispatched a massive army to assist Herod in his capture of Jerusalem. The siege lasted for about 2 months before Jerusalem and the temple were stormed by Herod and the Roman legionnaires. Following the successful assault, the Romans pillaged the city for days and only ceased looting when they were bought off by Herod. Antigonus was sent to Antony, who beheaded him, ending the Maccabean dynasty. The legacy of the Maccabeans cannot be overstated. They are remembered by Zionists and European imperialists as a family who stood against quote-unquote barbarism and for quote-unquote civilization. Their name was appropriated by numerous European kings and strongmen. The most famous example of their name being co-opted comes from the 700 CE, when, following the Battle of Tours, Charles, Duke and Prince of the Franks, took the name Martel, which translates to the hammer. This was done in direct reference to the Jewish Maccabees. Today, the Maccabee name is invoked as a cause célèbre for fascist citizens living in Israel. During an infamous incident in Amsterdam in late 2024, fans of the Maccabee soccer club harassed Arab people, ripped down Palestinian flags, and chanted, quote, "No more children left in Gaza," unquote, in the city center. When the Arab population in Amsterdam attempted to defend their community members, they were accused of starting, quote, "a pogrom against Jewish people," unquote. Upon taking power, Herod purged the leadership of the city of Jerusalem, killing half of the members of the ruling Jewish council known as the Sanhedrin. Next, he ordered the construction of a massive fortified tower, remembered as the Antonia, in honor of his patron, Mark Antony. In spite of his loyalty, Herod's lands were being whittled away by Antony, who in turn gifted them to Cleopatra. Under her rule, the Egyptian empire had become even more expansive than it was in the time of the ancient pharaohs. Her successes intimidated her male contemporaries and led to extreme jealousy. Her requests for more land left Herod's kingdom with a single port, Gaza, as the one avenue to the sea. On top of his ever-decreasing territory, Herod had to deal with the machinations of his mother-in-law, who was attempting to push her son into the position of high priest of Jerusalem. She was supported in her efforts by Cleopatra. Herod could not allow this threat to continue to grow. He had the claimant drowned and was ordered to face punishment by Antony. But Herod was so good at manipulating others that he convinced Antony that he had nothing to do with the assassination. While Herod was away, his wife, who was also his niece, began an affair with their shared uncle. Herod's mother-in-law was also plotting a new insurrection against him. When Herod came back, he executed his uncle and put his wife-niece in jail. Things were coming to a head in the greater Roman world as well. In Egypt, Antony had named Cleopatra, quote-unquote, Queen of Kings. Antony was also doling out parts of his eastern domain to his and Cleopatra's children. When Antony divorced Octavius's sister and took Cleopatra as his wife, it forever severed the relationship between Antony and Octavius. In Rome, Octavius began a propaganda campaign against Cleopatra, who he accused of plotting to subvert and overthrow Roman power. Using sexist arguments, which are still employed today, he whipped the Senate up into a misogynistic, xenophobic frenzy. The Senate formally revoked Antony's imperium in the east and then declared war on Cleopatra. Antony raised his banner in support of his wife. The coming clash would, in a roundabout way, decide the fate of Palestine. The two sides had been gearing up for such a conflict. They both had hundreds of naval vessels prepared and were able to quickly call massive armies into the field. Antony and Octavius were both subpar commanders, but Octavius had the talent of one of the great generals of the late Roman Republic, Marcus Agrippa, on his side. Agrippa was an extremely versatile commander, politician, and writer. He was also the maternal grandfather and maternal great-grandfather of Emperors Caligula and Nero, respectively. Prior to the war against Antony, Agrippa proved his prowess on the high seas by destroying Sextus Pompey's pirate empire. Against Antony, he menaced Grecian supply lines, which tenuously held out against his naval raids. His harassment forced Antony to retreat from the Central Balkans in order to find refuge and supply on the Greek coast. Antony and Cleopatra rolled the dice on a naval battle, which they hoped would end Agrippa's command of the waves. The two navies, each consisting of hundreds of vessels, met around Actium in modern-day Greece and engaged in one of the most decisive naval battles in world history. Our Ernest Dupuy and Trevor Dupuy state that, quote, Agrippa's fleet was formed in two wings and a center, each about equal in strength. These were opposed by three similar but smaller elements under Antony. Cleopatra commanded a reserve squadron of more than 60 vessels. Both Agrippa and Antony planned to envelop each other's north flank. The result was an immediate and violent struggle on that flank, in which Antony at first had slightly better of the engagement. But almost at once, the unfaithful center and left wings of the Antonine fleet either fled back into Actium or surrendered. Unquote. Somehow, Antony fought his way out of the maelstrom on the right and joined Cleopatra's reserves in a mad dash to Egypt. Herod was in a tough position. Up to that point, he was an active and loyal supporter of Antony. He had to come up with a way in which he could be useful to Octavian, who was about to invade Egypt. In the words of Simon Sebag Montefiore, Herod came to the future first emperor of Rome and, quote, asked Octavian not to consider whose friend he had been, but what sort of friend I am, unquote. Somehow, Herod escaped death and became a faithful ally to the new imperator until the end of his life. In Egypt, Antony killed himself, believing false rumors that Cleopatra was dead. Cleopatra surrendered herself to Octavian, but when he asserted that she would be led through the streets of Rome in Octavian's triumph, she chose death on her own terms, rather than death in the dungeons of Rome. Although we don't know the cause of her death with 100% certainty, it is widely believed that she or someone else forced an adder snake to bite her, and she died from the venom. Herod's domain was expanded to include parts of Cleopatra's and Antony's lands. It covered an area corresponding to parts of modern-day Palestine, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. However, even at its largest, Herod's domain never included the entire coastline of Palestine, nor the Naqab Desert. Additionally, the kingdom's subjects were never exclusively Jewish, nor were Jewish religious laws and precepts especially followed by Herod or his court nobles. They were too busy overseeing feasts and orgies with Arab Nabateans, Roman dignitaries, Jewish priests, Parthian adventurers, and Greek merchants. Nicolaus of Damascus wrote of Herod, quote, he was Phoenician by descent, Hellenized by culture, Idumean by place of birth, Jewish by religion, Jerusalemite by residence, and Roman by citizenship. Unquote. It was a perfect representation of the diverse mosaic of peoples, religions, and cultures present throughout Palestine's history. Although his domain expanded, Herod had other things with which he was preoccupied. He had many concubines of both sexes, but he believed his one quote-unquote true love was his wife-niece, Mariam. Their relationship was incredibly toxic. They oscillated between hateful rhetoric and loving embraces. Herod's sister attributed her brother's obsession with Mariam to quote-unquote magic. She brought evidence to Herod in the form of a supposed love potion. Put under torture, Mariam's eunuchs confessed to witnessing the supposed witchcraft. Herod threw his wife in jail once more, this time sentencing her to death. It was here that Mariam was likely strangled. Herod went berserk with grief. His already shaky mental health rapidly declined. Following his many debauched parties, he was found drunkenly raving around the castle, searching desperately for his deceased wife. Additionally, Herod had his mother-in-law executed, as well as 4 of his closest friends. When Herod was not in murderous rages, he devoted his time to turning Jerusalem into an extravagant capital city. He greatly expanded the citadel inside Jerusalem and built 3 defensive towers around it. One was named the Meriam. Herod personally funded all of these projects with the wealth he accumulated from the properties he owned throughout Palestine, as well as the larger Levantine coast. Herod then began reconstructing the Second Temple. Entire forests were felled in Lebanon, and the logs and stones collected were all sent to Palestine in huge barges. From here, the logs and stones were worked on by priests turned masons. Once the materials were embellished with intricate designs, they were brought into Jerusalem, and with the utmost silence, placed into their ornamental positions in the newly designed Second Temple. It took 2 years for the innermost sanctum to be completed, but the entire complex took almost 80 years to finish. Herod usually stayed at the Antonia fortress to the north of the temple. He had his own underground passageway installed, which connected the two. This was the temple which Jesus and his supporters were believed to have stormed during Passover in order to overturn the money changers' tables. This was also the temple that would be utterly destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE. Herod was close to Octavius and Agrippa, and they both supported his autocratic rule. Whatever he decreed in Palestine and Syria, the two usually backed. Herod's sons were constantly squabbling amongst themselves. Around 15 B.C.E., Herod formally disinherited 2 of his sons in favor of his long-neglected eldest son, Antipater. Herod then had the 2 disinherited boys killed after a vivid dream warned him of their supposed treachery. He also had 300 army officers executed when he caught wind of a conspiracy brewing amongst the officer corps. Supposedly uncovering a new conspiracy, this time from his new heir, Herod had his will redrawn for a 3rd time. The kingdom was now left to Antipas. This is the man who is said to have encountered Jesus Christ. Herod also ordered a Roman eagle to be placed atop the gates of the Second Temple. The eagle was torn down by Jewish students who claimed to be following the religious laws of the Torah. In turn, Herod ordered the students to be burned alive. While in his 60s, Herod's body began to literally rot. An intense itch overtook his entire torso, and his intestines began to glow a strange color. His feet and belly swelled up, while he also experienced severe stomach ulcers, and his body started oozing a strange, clear fluid. Finally, Herod's genitals swelled and burst into a gangrenous mass, which soon became infested with worms and maggots. The modern medical explanation is given by Simon Sebag Montefiore in a footnote. He states, quote, "The most likely diagnosis is that Herod suffered hypertension and arteriosclerosis, complicated by progressive dementia and by congestive heart and kidney failure. The arteriosclerosis led to venous congestion, aggravated by gravity, so that fluid collected in his feet and genitals, becoming so severe that the fluid bubbled through the skin. The blood flow became so poor that necrosis of the flesh, gangrene, developed. The bad breath and itching were caused by kidney failure. The penile scrotal gangrene provided ideal material for the laying of eggs by flies that hatched as maggots." Unquote. Around this time, 4 B.C.E., a child was born in Nazareth. His name was Joshua ben Joseph, but he is remembered by his Aramaic name, Jesus. The Gospels of the New Testament claim that as he lay dying, Herod ordered the extermination of all newborn male babies in his domain, in the hopes of prematurely snuffing out the life of this miraculous prince. As with many stories in the Bible, there is no historical evidence that this occurred. More than likely, the killing of the innocents, as described in the New Testament, is a literary reference to the Old Testament and God's plague that was set upon Egyptian firstborn sons. This is only the start of the many contradictions which crop up throughout the New Testament in regards to Jesus' life and death. Another obvious example is Jesus' place of birth. The Bible claims that his family was forced to travel to Bethlehem in order to register for the Roman census, at which time Jesus was born. Historically, the first Roman census was performed in Palestine in 6 C.E., a full 10 years after the death of Herod and the supposed birth of Jesus. Additionally, there is no reason why the Romans would require a family from Nazareth to travel 90 miles to Bethlehem in order to participate in a census. We also know that Herod died in 4 B.C.E., meaning there is no way Jesus could have been born in year 1 C.E. Therefore, Jesus, at the very least, must have been older than the Bible claims. There is also a question as to if Jesus had siblings. The Bible tells us different things. In some books of the New Testament, he has brothers and sisters. In others, Mary remains a virgin until her death. Finally, and most crucially, Jesus was not unique in his message of incoming Armageddon and radical social and political change. He was among many prophets who claimed the divine spoke through them. In one instance, 3 of these messiahs proclaimed themselves kings, and alongside their followers they raided the countryside of Palestine at will. The army was dispatched, and Roman forces brutally crushed the uprising. They crucified thousands in the aftermath. Following Herod's death, Octavius, the first Augustus of Rome, split up Herod's former kingdom between 3 of his surviving sons. The emperor withheld the title of king, refusing to grant any of Herod's children as such. Instead, he appointed the 3 of them to be tetrarchs of the various areas of Herod's old kingdom. One of these tetrarchs proved to be an incompetent fool, and he was removed from his position by the Romans. The land he governed was directly annexed into Rome and was officially administered from Caesarea Palestinae, which became a vibrant coastal city as a result. The other 2 descendants of Herod ruled their small domains at the behest of Rome for many decades, until a preacher, remembered as John the Baptist, began preaching redemption and healing the sick. John the Baptist helps to prove the above assertion that Jesus Christ's message was not only his. In many ways, John walked so that Jesus could run, while also acting as a mentor and spiritual teacher for Jesus. John was coincidentally related to Jesus. He gained a following in the hills and countryside outside of Jerusalem by healing the sick, feeding the poor, and railing against the corruption of the Herodians and their Roman overlords. These acts of sedition turned John into a political rebel in the eyes of the Romans and their client kings, who needed Roman approval for nearly every decision. One of these client kings was Herod Antipas. In 18 CE, he founded the city of Tiberias around the Sea of Galilee. Its founding deeply shocked the local economy of the area and forced many peasants into destitution. Like his father, Antipas believed he was in love with his own niece. The 2 were quickly married, and they soon became the focus of John the Baptist's criticisms. He castigated the pair as a modern-day Ahab and Jezebel. This deeply upset the 2, as well as their extended family. Following the marriage celebrations, Antipas promised to fulfill any request for his wife and her daughter. They asked for the head of John, who had recently been captured and imprisoned by Antipas. As a result, Antipas ordered John to be beheaded. John's cousin, Jesus, fled from Jerusalem and took to the hills, where he began following in his teacher's footsteps. Richard A. Horsley, world-renowned Bible scholar, argues that Jesus' mission, tactics, and eventual execution were inherently politically motivated. He also argues that the current state of biblical study is completely inadequate for understanding the historical Jesus, if he did exist. Horsley argues that almost everything about Jesus was political, while also being based in a return to the religious order and laws which once governed Jewish Palestine. He claims that when Jesus confronted the Pharisees and overturned the money changers' tables, he was making a political statement about the corruption which had plagued Palestine ever since Rome had conquered the area. The reason the political aspect of Jesus' life are often glossed over are not very complex. First of all, it is inconvenient for evangelical billionaires and megachurch pastors who drive Lamborghinis to come to terms with the fact that Jesus preached a revolutionary version of wealth redistribution and actively railed against the rich and powerful. Second of all, Jesus' teachings are almost always taken out of context of the larger biblical story and usually removed from their historical context altogether. Finally, few Western biblical scholars appreciate or acknowledge the fact that religion, society, and politics have always been inherently intertwined. It was only recently in human history that the concept of separation of church and state was accepted. Prior to that, religion used the state, and the state used religion in order to justify each other's actions and inaction. One of the best examples of Jesus' socialist teachings is seen in the Lord's Prayer. Richard A. Horsley tells us the prayer is, quote, inherently political and economic, as well as religious. Jesus teaches people to pray for the direct rule, kingdom of God, and for sufficient bread, and for cancellation of debt, unquote. These ideas obviously perturbed Roman authorities, but Jesus was not the most popular or well-known of the prophets of his day, so he was allowed to preach in the countryside relatively unharassed. Troubles arose when Jesus arrived in Jerusalem for Passover. Once there, he became increasingly enraged at the quote-unquote temple state, as well as with the Pharisees who ran the city at the behest of Rome's appointed governor, Pontius Pilate. He was especially perturbed at the sight of the opulent Second Temple, which he said he would destroy and rebuild in 3 days, quote, not with human hands, unquote, but spiritually. Jesus was confronted by the Pharisees, and they attempted to entrap him. They demanded to know if he truly believed tribute should be withheld from the Roman Empire or not. Jesus recognized the gotcha question, and after calling the crowd of Roman puppets hypocrites, he says, quote, give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's, unquote. Almost everyone who quotes this passage uses it as a justification for the quote-unquote apolitical nature of Jesus. I've even seen the famous new atheist Christopher Hitchens argue that Jesus was pro-capitalism, based solely on this single utterance. Almost no one takes the above quote for what it was, a very shrewd way to make a point about the spineless, Roman-aligned ruling class and their stolen wealth. If Jesus was justifying Roman rule, then why was he quickly apprehended in the days following this incident? If he was justifying the oppression of the people, then why were the oppressors standing around him left dumbfounded by his response? What Jesus essentially said here, in modern terms, is Caesar is going to get what he deserves, not in a good way, and God is going to get what he deserves, and he deserves everything. This quote was in every way an eloquent protest against the Romans and against the oppression of the Palestinian people. If Jesus existed, he must have realized his days were numbered. He understood that the authorities of Roman Palestine used violence as a tool. In fact, violence functioned as the main motivating factor for around 1 million Roman subjects and client state subjects. The peasantry did not take this state-sanctioned violence lying down. They actively resisted Roman rule, and not just through violent rebellion. In one instance, Palestinians living in Galilee peacefully protested en masse for their rights. Pontius Pilate threatened the entire population with extermination, but they still refused to work. Had this work stoppage continued, it would have imperiled Rome's tribute. Realizing that the people's labor was what allowed them to survive and live in luxury, the Romans relented. In 4 B.C.E., following Herod's death, uprisings took place across Palestine. This would happen time and again throughout the rule of the Roman Empire. These uprisings were always provoked by the oppressors, the Roman Empire and their Herodian collaborators inside Palestine. The people made it clear that their gripes were largely economical. In numerous uprisings, they took special care to burn the Roman ledgers which maintained their financial debts. The uprisings were further inflamed by the racist ramblings of Roman conservatives. Cicero, for example, believed the people of Palestine and Syria were, quote, born slaves, unquote. For the Palestinians who chose rebellion, Roman justice was swift and unbelievably violent. They made Alexander the Great and Antiochus Epiphanes look like saints by comparison. Mass crucifixion was the main punishment employed for the rebels accused of taking part in these uprisings. This punishment would be doled out to Jesus Christ, who was killed in between two supposed quote-unquote bandits. However, these men may have been political revolutionaries who were fighting to free Palestine from Roman oppression. Today, it seems the term bandits has given way to terrorists, but the intent of the oppressors remains the same. Dehumanize the indigenous, deny their reality, and destroy those that refuse to submit. The story goes that Jesus was betrayed by one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, for a mere 30 pieces of silver. Tracked down by the high priests and the legionnaires, Jesus was arrested. From here, Jesus was put on trial by Jerusalem's parasite class and Governor Pontius Pilate. The Gospels tell us that upon being found guilty, Pilate washed his hands of anything to do with Jesus' death. But this seems incredibly unlikely. Pilate had never cared about the life and death of people under his governance before, so the idea that he would start now seems incredibly unlikely. In all likelihood, this embellishment was added by Christians after the fact, in order to free Rome of guilt and redirect the anger at the death of Christ to the practitioners of the Jewish religion. Anti-Semitic Christians claim that it was the, quote, fault of all Jewish people, unquote, for the death of the Christian Messiah. The reality is that, if he was real, the blood of Jesus Christ was spilled by the Roman Empire alone. He was killed by an imperial system not so dissimilar to the many which exist today, which treat Palestinian people and all indigenous peoples the world over as if they are not human. Before being crucified, Jesus was subject to intense torture. Once nailed to the cross, Jesus lasted only a few hours. Once dead, his side was pierced with the holy lance, and he was buried in a rock tomb. The Bible claims that 3 days after his execution, Jesus was resurrected, and then ascended into heaven, where he joined God at his right hand. The reality is that it would take several decades for the story of Jesus and his martyrdom to take hold as their own separate spiritual teachings, but his example would inspire the many branches of the Christian religion, which now has over 2 billion followers. At least at first, the execution of Jesus barely registered in the greater Roman world. In Rome, the second emperor Tiberius was on his deathbed. He had ruled for 23 years, defined by court intrigues and whispered conspiracies. Tiberius was a reclusive emperor. The actual men in charge were his children and his top praetorian guards. One guard in particular, Sejanus, amassed such political power that he very nearly became the emperor's son-in-law. Before that could happen, he was accused of plotting to kill Tiberius, and he was executed. Additionally, the Roman Senate hated Tiberius. They accused him of a litany of abuses, which included pedophilia. As the emperor aged, there was little consideration as to who would be named his successor. Both of Tiberius's immediate heirs were dead, leaving Caligula and Gemellus, his grandchildren, as possible options. Tiberius died when he was 77. He was supposedly smothered by Caligula and the head of his Praetorian Guard, as he was attempting to recover from a prolonged illness. Tiberius's will decreed that governance of the empire should fall to both Caligula and his young grandson Gemellus. Caligula's first decree upon seizing power was to void his grandfather's will and then kill Gemellus, ensuring he was the sole emperor of Rome. One of Caligula's best friends was Herod Agrippa, the grandson of Herod the Great. At the time of Tiberius's death, Herod Agrippa was languishing in a Roman dungeon. But upon the ascension of Caligula, he was released and named a king in his native Palestine. He then successfully conspired to remove Antipas from his position and gained even more territory in Palestine at his uncle's expense. In Rome, Caligula ordered his own worship as a living deity. The Jewish peoples in Palestine refused to worship anyone but Yahweh as a god. In response, Caligula ordered the Roman governor of Syria to destroy Jerusalem. However, Herod Agrippa stood up for his people back in Palestine. He defiantly told the emperor, quote, "I, as you know, am by birth Jewish, and my native city is Jerusalem, in which is situated the sacred shrine of the Most High God. This temple, my lord Gaius, has never from the first admitted any figure wrought by men's hands, because it is the sanctuary of the true God. Your grandfather, Marcus Agrippa, visited and paid honor to the temple, and so did Augustus. I exchange all the benefits you've given me for one thing only, that the ancestral institutions be not disturbed. Either I must seem a traitor to my own people, or no longer be counted your friend as I have been. There is no other alternative." Unquote. Caligula relented, and Jerusalem, as well as the Second Temple, were spared for now. In late 37 CE, Caligula recovered from an unknown illness, but whatever it was deeply agitated his already troubled mind. He began acting more and more erratically, supposedly having incestuous relationships with his 3 sisters, while also naming his horse as consul. There are several theories about what happened to Caligula. His erratic behavior may have been caused by an untreated mental illness, by childhood trauma at the hands of his pedophilic grandfather, or by epileptic fits, from which many people in the Julian dynasty suffered. In 41, as Caligula and Herod Agrippa were leaving a theater, the emperor was assassinated by his own Praetorian Guard. After killing the emperor, they murdered his wife and newborn baby. Herod Agrippa composed himself and then quickly gained control of the situation. He led a group of Praetorians through the imperial residences in search of a member of the imperial family who could take Caligula's place. Hiding behind a curtain, they found Claudius, Caligula's uncle. Claudius was a Republican. He attempted to deny the offer, but Herod Agrippa persuaded him to accept the throne. Herod Agrippa returned to Palestine in the fashion of a hero. He had coins minted in his honor which read, quote, "Great King Agrippa, friend of Caesar." Unquote. One of Herod Agrippa's main objectives during his governance was to crack down on the new groups of Jewish Christians who were springing up in Palestine. These coincided with crackdowns on early Christians throughout the Roman world. Many of these early Christians still called themselves Jewish believers, although the first clear signs of rupture between early Christianity and Judaism began to form during this period. Herod Agrippa died unexpectedly, with some historians speculating that he was poisoned by Romans who had grown wary of the political power he was amassing in Asia. His son became the next leader, but his inexperience was exploited by the Romans in order to maintain direct political control over Palestine. They continued to murder the rebellious and tax the helpless into extreme poverty. As the client states of Palestine fell deeper into corruption and complacency, it took a bottom-up series of targeted assassinations to wake the ruling classes from their stupor. Remembered as the Sicarii, these dagger men were responsible for numerous politically and religiously motivated assassinations. They deeply frightened the ruling classes of Palestine, but instead of offering reforms to a broken system, they cracked down harshly on those that resisted their tyrannical rule. There were numerous instances of Roman soldiers provoking riots and starting stampedes, which led to the deaths of thousands of Palestinians. In Rome, Claudius was poisoned by his wife, paving the way for Nero to take control of an empire which encompassed the entirety of the Mediterranean. Nero gave large tracts of land to Herod Agrippa II, while making sure the Roman procurators were the true rulers of Palestine. In the countryside, messiahs and prophets were abundant. Amongst them was Paul of Tarsus, a former Pharisee and one of those responsible for the crackdown on early Christians in Palestine. In 37 CE, Paul had a vision in which Jesus called upon him to become the 13th disciple and spread the word of Christianity to all. Simon Sebag Montefiore writes, quote, "Paul's letters dominate the New Testament, forming a quarter of its books." Unquote. Paul began a new era for Christianity, which allowed anyone to convert as opposed to restricting conversion. He was especially successful in converting so-called God-fearers, or those who believed in the Jewish God but did not follow every aspect of the Jewish faith. Amongst these God-fearers were many upper-class Roman women, including Agrippina, the mother of Nero. In 58 CE, Paul arrived in Jerusalem in order to settle theological disagreements with James, the brother of Jesus. Paul was recognized and arrested, beginning a several years-long saga of trials and imprisonment, ending in his beheading at the hands of Nero in 64. James, the brother of Jesus, was also captured and sentenced to death. In 62, he was thrown from the walls of the Second Temple and then stoned to death. Around this time, the exterior compound of the Second Temple was finally completed. In Rome, Nero had killed his own mother and reportedly kicked his wife, who was with child, to death. There were also rumors that he started the Great Fire of Rome in 64, although this cannot be verified. Additionally, he was responsible for harshly persecuting both Jewish and early Christian believers. In short, there were plenty of reasons to despise Nero and his rule, but until the second half of his reign, people loved him. It was only when the empire's economy began to falter that the people of Rome began to openly oppose Nero, and Nero was simply not equipped to handle these many crises. In Palestine, the newest procurator of the empire was a man named Gessius Florus. Like most of his predecessors, he was tyrannical, corrupt, and quick to violence. Perhaps any other time, his use of violence to intimidate the population into obedience would have worked. But as the empire's economy collapsed, so did the established social order. People were finally desperate enough to fight for their lives. Herod Agrippa II and his wife begged the people to show restraint and not attempt to defy the Romans. The priests, including future historian Flavius Josephus, started the uprising in Jerusalem. They debated what they should do, and as they talked, the people formed armed factions. Amongst these factions were the Zealots, who were first given this moniker by Josephus. They are described by Josephus as, quote, ruthless cutthroats and bandits, unquote. But considering the fact that Josephus was a part of the moderate faction which was overthrown by the Zealots, his description must be taken with a grain of salt. Unfortunately, no documentation exists wherein the Zealots speak for themselves. Additionally, Josephus was writing for a Roman audience, and his patrons were Roman emperors. In short, the accounts of Josephus, like much of history, must be read with the author's biases in mind. The Zealots, alongside the Sicarii, gained control of the city and stormed the Second Temple. They torched the houses of the rich and destroyed the ledgers where the deaths of the city's residents were written. After the murder of the leader of the Sicarii, that faction fled the city to Masada Fortress in south-central Palestine, where they remained until the end of the conflict. 600 Romans remained besieged inside the city, and after being promised safe passage, they were killed by the people of Jerusalem. Herod Agrippa II proved his loyalty to Rome and fled to Syria, where he was involved in a botched assault on the city in 66 CE. During this failed assault, 5,000 Romans were killed, and a Roman eagle was lost. Inside the city, Josephus recounts that faction fought against faction in a bitter civil war for power. It's important to bear in mind that Josephus is one of the only contemporary sources which are available to us, and his opinion is extremely skewed. Josephus was made a general and dispatched to Galilee, where he led the resistance against Roman invasion. A member of Nero's entourage, Vespasian, whose main claim to fame up until that point was his rearing of mules for the Roman army, was sent to annihilate Josephus. In 67 CE, Vespasian gathered an army of 60,000. A large portion of it were auxiliaries from Syria, as well as Herod Agrippa's entourage. Throughout the early months of 67, the armies of Vespasian and Josephus clashed. The Jewish defenders of Galilee resisted Vespasian's army fiercely. Unfortunately for the people of Palestine, Josephus and the other rebel commanders were no match for the Roman military machine. Following the fall of Jotapata, Josephus and the other rebel generals were surrounded by the Romans. They held out in a cave, and Josephus tells us that his comrades killed themselves rather than fall into the enemy's hands. Josephus survived by sheer luck. Emerging as the sole survivor from the cave, he was tossed in front of Vespasian. Josephus begged for his life, but he also made a prediction. He foresaw Vespasian and his sons as emperors. Vespasian liked the sound of that, and instead of killing Josephus, he decided to keep him under house arrest. The former rebel general rapidly developed a friendship with Vespasian's son, Titus. This whole time, Jerusalem was falling deeper into chaos. Ambitious warriors from across Palestine were attempting to assert dominance over the city. John of Giscela was one of these petty tyrants. He allied himself with the Idumeans, who stormed the city and supposedly killed 12,000 people in the process. John turned the Second Temple into a brothel and held nightly orgies inside of it. Outside the gates of Jerusalem, Simon ben Giora was gathering supporters for his cause as well. He also stormed the city and relegated John's faction to the Second Temple, where he remained besieged. Not far away, the Roman army of Vespasian was closing in on the city. There were 3 armies who were all fighting for control of a single city. The factions inside of Jerusalem only stopped fighting one another and began fortifying their city against impending Roman assault after the fall of nearby Jericho. In Rome, things were even more chaotic. Nero had killed himself after being declared a public enemy to Rome, and numerous false Neros sprang up in his place. Meanwhile, 4 separate Romans had declared themselves emperors in the span of a year. One of these was Vespasian, who had gained the loyalty of the legionnaires stationed in Egypt and Greater Syria. Vespasian's campaign in Palestine became a sideshow, as he traveled to Rome in order to secure imperial power. He left the siege operations around Jerusalem to his son, Titus. Titus set about methodically besieging the city, which had recently accepted an influx of religious pilgrims, swelling the population of the city to perhaps hundreds of thousands of people. In early spring of 70 CE, the assault on Jerusalem began. The fighting for the outer and inner walls of the city was intense, and the Jewish rebels inflicted significant losses on Titus's men. After 15 days of fighting, the gates were finally breached with battering rams, forcing the rebels to retreat into Jerusalem. The legionnaires were so exhausted, and their forces so depleted, that they needed several days to rest before continuing their assault, this time targeting the Antonia fortress. In the interim, Josephus, who had been released from prison at this point and was now a confidant for Titus, went before his fellow residents of Jerusalem. He attempted to explain to them that their actual struggle was, quote, not with Rome, but with God, unquote. He called on the people to surrender to the Romans, arguing that they respected Jewish holy sites as opposed to the rebels who desecrated them. He was met with jeers and derision from his former compatriots, who refused to surrender. In order to prevent anyone from attempting to escape from the city or flank their position, the Romans began the process of circumvallation, in which a continuous line of fortified earthworks is constructed around a besieged site. Anyone found attempting to leave was executed. 500 prisoners a day were crucified in front of the city's walls. When a rumor began to spread that Jewish prisoners were hiding gold in their stomachs, the Romans began gutting their captives. Josephus claims Titus tried to stop these horrors, but his decrees did little to stop the soldiers whose main priority was loot. Inside the city, the people were treated cruelly by those claiming to fight on their behalf. Many were tortured and forced into giving away their valuables and what little food they had. People began to starve. Their bodies were left to rot in the streets. Those who argued for surrender were publicly executed by the rebels, and their bodies were mutilated beyond recognition. Once the Roman army had sufficiently recovered from their tribulations, they began their siege of the Antonia fortress, which overlooked the Second Temple. They captured this structure relatively easily after they constructed massive siege works to storm its walls. They now had the Second Temple in their sights. First, they attempted to construct mines underneath the temple, but these were countered by the rebels, resulting in deadly and futile underground clashes. Next, they attempted to breach the Second Temple's courtyard using siege towers. At first, they were successful, but they were forced back by the sheer ferocity of resistance they met. Josephus asserts that Titus did all he could to preserve the Second Temple, arguing that Titus considered it a testament to Roman power to see the structure preserved. Others have argued that Titus intentionally ordered the destruction of the temple in order to eradicate the Jewish and Christian religions. Considering Josephus owed his life and freedom to Titus, his account, at the very least in respect to Titus's personal opinion, cannot be trusted. In all likelihood, Titus ordered the destruction of the Second Temple. After days of fighting for the courtyard of the temple, it was breached, and in the maelstrom the inner sanctum, or the Holy of Holies, caught fire. The fire spread, and in the confusion of plunder, destruction, and death, the Second Temple was utterly destroyed. The Romans continued their destruction of the rest of the city. Only the 3 towers built around the temple remained standing. What happened next is still widely debated, though it really shouldn't be. If we were to believe the Zionist narrative, which is based almost solely on the works of Josephus, Titus deported and exiled nearly 1 million Jewish people to the 4 corners of the Mediterranean. This, they claim, created a Jewish quote-unquote diaspora, who were forced from their ancestral homeland at the hands of a conquering force. It was in many ways a tragic repeat of the destruction of the First Temple at the hands of the Babylonians. Zionists further claim that this quote-unquote exiled diaspora remained ethnically, genetically, and culturally separate from the people they lived alongside until finally being allowed to return to their quote-unquote homeland from which they had been exiled. This, quote, unbroken history of the Jewish people, unquote, remains a core belief at the foundations of Zionism. However, there is no evidence that the Romans ever forcibly deported entire populations or any mass groupings of people. They were undoubtedly incredibly brutal, but exiling 1 million people made no sense, as the Romans wished to further exploit their subjects. They would occasionally forcibly displace a small farming population in order to make room for Roman settlement and colonization, but besides this, no mass expulsions were practiced, nor is there any archaeological evidence of such an act occurring in Palestine. Next, we have to deal with the fact that the numbers provided by Josephus are completely unreliable. He, like many ancient historians, greatly inflated their population and casualty figures. For example, Josephus asserts that there were 4 million inhabitants in the Galilee region of Palestine alone. This number is astronomically high, and simply could not have been achieved without advancements in agriculture that simply weren't present during this era. At its most prosperous under Roman rule, Palestine contained no more than 1 million people. We should also bear in mind the significant number of religious pilgrims, which was vast, but they alone only accounted for either tens of thousands or at most 100,000 people. Furthermore, there was another Jewish rebellion following the Great Jewish Rebellion, which was remembered as the Bar Kokhba Revolt. It occurred in the 130s CE, nearly 60 years after the Siege of Jerusalem, so there were still Jewish people living in the area at this time. Additionally, Jewish believers lived in Palestine in the years following this second revolt. In 220, for example, Rabbi Judah Hanasi completed the final arrangements of the Mishnah, a crucial text in the development of Jewish literature. Finally, the term galut, which means exile in ancient Hebrew, may have been misinterpreted by modern theologians and historians. Shlomo Sand asserts, quote, Chaim Milikowski, a scholar at Bar Ilan University, has found evidence in numerous contemporary rabbinical sources that in the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, the term galut, exile, was used in the sense of political subjugation rather than deportation, unquote. Other rabbis consider the Babylonian exile to be the only true exile, and they consider that exile ongoing. So how exactly did the fabricated story of Roman exile take hold? Based on what we know, it seems to have been the invention of anti-Semitic Christians, who believed the presence of Jewish people outside of Palestine was proof of their, quote, punishment from God, unquote, for their, quote-unquote, betrayal of Jesus. Shlomo Sand asserts that this was the origin of the anti-Semitic stereotype of the, quote, wandering Jewish person, punished for his transgressions, unquote. This historical reality concerning the second exile is rarely confronted by historians in any meaningful way. When we consider that it is one of the central pieces which keeps the Zionist house of cards from blowing into the wind, it is easy to see why that is. For example, in almost every source for this series, the subject of the second exile is rarely brought up, or the authors conveniently skirt around the issue. In one of my sources, the Harper's Military Encyclopedia, the writers actively assert that the Jewish people were dispersed, not exiled, but it asserts that they were dispersed after the Bar Kokhba revolt of the 130s. In another source, A History of the Arab-Israeli Conflict, the authors also claim that the Jewish people were dispersed, creating the quote-unquote Jewish diaspora. Zionist historians also have a hard time explaining away or hiding the fact that no expulsion of Jewish Palestinians occurred in 70 CE. Instead, some have asserted that the expulsion actually occurred when Islamo-Arabic invaders arrived and, quote, displaced the Jewish people, unquote, in the 7th century. This so-called theory is not based in any historical reality, as we know that the relatively small Arabic armies which initially took Jerusalem from the Byzantine Empire contained many Jewish believers and warriors. In fact, early Muslim armies likely had assistance from Jewish Palestinians in conquering Jerusalem. Additionally, we know that Omar the Just, an early Muslim caliph, allowed the Jewish people back into the city for the first time in centuries. In short, the Arab armies who took Palestine were liberators of the Jewish population. In spite of these well-documented and attested facts, Arab Palestinians are now accused of being the quote-unquote real occupiers, while the settlers, who actively occupy, torture, assault, rape, and kill innocent Palestinians with legal impunity believe they are somehow being oppressed by their victims. It's also important to bear in mind that Jewish people and communities have existed outside of Palestine long before the Jewish revolt of 70 CE. Zionists have attempted to hide away these communities. They claim that these sizable communities were exclusively the result of Jewish migration from Palestine. They also assert that Jewish families were, quote, especially kind to their children, unquote, and that the average Jewish family multiplied much more rapidly than, quote-unquote, other races. This, they claim, is how the Jewish religion spread. It was an internal process of growth as opposed to an outward process of migration and proselytization. Once again, Zionist arguments fall flat on their face when confronted with historical reality. We have already discussed in our second episode, Kings, how the Maccabees imposed Judaism on their immediate neighbors in Palestine. But there was also a rapid and widespread movement of religious conversion by Jewish practitioners across the rest of the Roman world. In nearby Damascus, Josephus talks about the people in the city plotting to kill the men who were Jewish believers living there. The Syrians supposedly hesitated because their wives all followed the Jewish religion. It is unlikely that these women followed the Jewish religion before marriage, so one of the few conclusions we can reach is that they had converted after marriage. Josephus also tells us of a small kingdom within the borders of modern-day Kurdistan, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, which embraced Judaism as their court religion for several generations. Across the Mediterranean world, up until the foundation of Christianity as the state religion of Rome, Judaism spread its message of the afterlife and eventual salvation. To the east of Palestine, Judaism spread steadily until the rise of Islam. It was only then that Judaism turned inward and stopped its active mission of mass conversion. Rome was full of Jewish believers, from Gaul to North Africa to the Italian peninsula. At its height, maybe 8% of Rome's population worshipped Yahweh. Cassius Dio writes about the proliferation of the Jewish religion, saying, quote, I do not know how this title, Jewish, came to be given to them, but it applies also to all the rest of mankind, although of alien race, who affect their customs, unquote. The early Palestinian Christian theologian Origen also writes about the Jewish religion. He says, quote, the noun Judeos is not the name of an ethnos, but of a choice in lifestyle. For if there be someone not from the nation of the Jewish people, a Gentile, who accepts the ways of the Jewish faith and becomes a proselyte, this person would properly be called Judeos, unquote. Even in the time of the Roman Empire, being Jewish was never about being from somewhere specifically, nor was it about dominating that land exclusively. It was about following a set of beliefs, just like any other religion. And just like any other religion, problems arise when religion is used to claim superiority. Judaism became especially attractive to Romans who were on the outside looking in. Women, freemen, and enslaved peoples actively embraced Judaism, and it became a true threat to the established order. When Christianity became the state religion of Rome, Judaism was actively persecuted, and conversion to the religion was punishable by death. The question remains, what happened to the vast majority of Palestine's Jewish population after 70 CE? Quite simply, very little. They maintained their religious practices, which had always been legal in the Roman Empire. As Christianity developed, some converted, while others couldn't come to terms with the idea of the Trinity, and they maintained their Jewish beliefs. Palestine slowly became majority Christian. When Zionists first arrived in the late 19th century, it was Christian Palestinians who were the first to ring the alarm bells about their true intentions. When Islam arrived in the 7th century, converts were easily won amongst the Jewish Palestinians who found kinship in the monotheistic nature of this new religion. Others remained Jewish. In time, those Jewish Palestinians who became Muslim would learn the Arabic language, as it was and is the language of Islam. This would lead to them adopting an Arabic cultural outlook as well. Today, they are called Muslim Arab Palestinians, and they have always remained rooted in the land of Palestine as firmly as an olive tree. As it stands, Zionist arguments hold no real weight and can be dispelled easily with even a cursory glance at archaeological and historical evidence. Following the destruction of Jerusalem, several things happened which affected Palestine. First, Titus was celebrated in Rome with a triumph held in his honor. Throughout the streets of Rome, his veterans carried the giant candelabra which once sat solemnly in the Second Temple. A massive stone arch, remembered as the Arch of Titus, was built in Rome, where it remains standing to this day. The Jewish rebellion continued until 73 CE, when Masada Fortress was finally captured by the Romans. The rebel leader gave a final speech to the men, women, and children who were trapped inside. He said, quote, "We long ago, my generous friends, resolved never to be servants to the Romans, nor to any other than God himself. We were the first that revolted against them. We are the last that fight against them, and I cannot but esteem it as a favor that God has granted us that it is still in our power to die bravely and in a state of freedom, in a glorious manner, together with our dearest friends. Let our wives die before they are abused, and our children before they have tasted slavery." Unquote. The 900 defenders of Masada killed their families and then themselves. Today, Masada is the place in which new recruits of the IDF swear to defend the state of Israel. They swear that, quote, "Masada will never fall again," unquote. They fail to realize that Masada has already fallen, and they are the new Romans. Emperor Vespasian's dynasty was one of the last stable Roman dynasties. Following his death, Titus would reign for just 2 years before dying mysteriously and being replaced by his brother, Domitian. Domitian had no legitimate heirs, so he chose Trajan, his top general, to become the new emperor. Trajan would become one of the great military leaders of his era, but he is also remembered for violently cracking down on the Jewish and Christian religions. His adopted son, Hadrian, would begin to reforge the empire in his own image. Besides constructing the boundaries of the empire along Hadrian's Wall, he began reforming the political makeup of his empire. In 130 CE, he visited Jerusalem with his lover, Antinos, where he decreed that Jerusalem no longer existed. The new name of the city was Aelia Capitolina. It would remain this name until the late 1100s. Hadrian also banned circumcision. Those found practicing it were publicly executed. Finally, he laid the foundation stone for a massive temple to Jupiter, supposedly on the very site where Jesus Christ was executed. He was planning to build another shrine on the Temple Mount, complete with an equestrian statue of himself, but once he departed, the Jewish believers of Aelia Capitolina rebelled once more. This rebellion was led by the elusive Bar Kokhba, or the Son of the Star. Unlike the Great Jewish Revolt, the Jewish people of Palestine seemed united under Bar Kokhba, and he rapidly kicked out the Roman governor and began minting coins in his own name. One interesting aspect of this revolt is that Bar demanded his followers cut off one of their own fingers to prove their devotion. Hadrian called his best general from Britain to put down the rebellion. The general, Julius Severus, utterly destroyed any hope of resistance for the Palestinians who opposed him. Cassius Dio claims tens of thousands of people and hundreds of towns were utterly destroyed. Once again, these numbers seem incredibly high. At this point, the Romans banned all Jewish presence in Aelia Capitolina, and this decree remained in effect in some form or another until Muslim armies overtook the city. In the words of Nur Masalha, quote, In 135 A.D., Emperor Hadrian officially combined the minor Roman procutorial province of Judea, comprising Judea and Samaria, with the old Philistia, the Galilee in the north, and Idumea in the south, to form a new major proconsular province of Syria Palestina. Unquote. This was distinct from the neighboring interior and northern Roman provinces, named Roman Phoenicia and Hollow Syria, respectively. Most Romans simply called the land Palestine, as Roman Syria was a separate province altogether. There are numerous instances of the land being called Palestine in the works of native Syrian Palestinians, as well as travelers who came to the area. Appian of Alexandria writes, quote, "Turning our course, we take in Palestine, Syria, and beyond it, a part of Arabia. The Phoenicians hold the country next to Palestine on the sea, and beyond the Phoenician territory are Hollow Syria." Unquote. As for native descriptions of the land, we turn to Justine the Martyr, one of the earliest Christian missionaries who was murdered by Roman authorities for his beliefs. He writes that his native city is, quote, "Flavia Neapolis in Palestine." Unquote. Flavia Neapolis is modern-day Nablus. This means that Naples, Italy, and Nablus, Palestine, are sister cities, named after the same person. It's important to bear in mind that the area of land we're discussing has always been referred to as Palestine, or some other spelling of the word. Only now it was officially recognized by Roman authorities. It is also wrong to assume that the Roman province of Palestine, quote-unquote, replaced Judea, as Judea was always treated as an integral part of Palestine. Never once was the Palestinian province of Judea composed of an ethnically distinct people, and the population of Judea was never entirely Jewish. One thing remains certain about this period of history, and that is the suffering experienced by the Jewish Palestinians during the Great Revolt and Bar Kokhba's rebellion was horrific. Today, the acts of violence initiated by the Romans would be considered war crimes of the highest degree. The suffering the Jewish Palestinians endured during this time is being repeated today in places like Gaza, Tehran, Khartoum, Bukavu, Kiev, and countless other regions. In all these instances, money, power, racism, and greed have stood against human liberty, dignity, and peace. In all of these instances, people have had to come to terms with the harsh reality of their situation, and in spite of it all, keep trying to survive. Melissa and I will continue to tell the truth about history, here, for free, because it is essential that we all know our true history so that we can forge a better path toward the future. We will continue to shine a light on the stories that need to be told, especially now, in the hopes that someday we can find peace with each other and with the earth, which naturally provides for us all, regardless of our culture, class, religion, gender, or any other societal qualifier. On the next episode of the Turning Tides podcast, Romans, we will cover the next 500 years of Palestinian history, including the rise of the Christian religion, the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and the rise of Islam. I hope you'll join us then. Thank you all so much for listening. Have a great day.
If you like what you heard today, you can support us by donating on PayPal at Turning Tides Podcast 1. We would also appreciate it if you take the time to rate and review Turning Tides on whatever platform you use to listen, and share the show with your family and friends. It really helps us bring the show to more listeners. Thank you so much for the support, and thanks again for listening.